Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear he thinks the best way to bring the hostages home is to defeat Hamas on the battlefield. So the emergence of a possible hostage deal this week has come as a bit of a surprise. Today, Gershon Baskin returns as our guest to look at what we know about those still held in Gaza and the negotiations to release them. Hello and welcome, Gershon.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Great to have you back with us. I just wanted to start by saying that one of the most awful things about this terrible conflict is not just the sheer appalling nature of it, the vile nature of October the 7th, and now the incredible loss of life in Gaza, 34,500, vast majority of them women and children. I think one of the awful things is the inability of people on both sides to recognise things happening to the other. The sense there's only one sense of only one side can be the victim, and it's just a really terribly sort of partisan thing. And I know that you are obviously one of the main voices who's been emphasising that there are victims all around here. So it's always good to have you with us. Can we say just a bit about who is in captivity? Just remind us. I mean, it's over 6 months now. It's incredible to. I mean, It's almost 7 months. It's almost seven
Almost
months.
7 months.
Yeah.
There were about 240 Israelis and foreign workers taken on October 7th into Gaza. They ranged from infants of 10 months old to senior citizens well into their 80s. A lot of women, a lot of children. There are 133 that remain in captivity. There was an exchange deal that took place in the end of November of 2023, which brought the majority of the women and the children back, but there are still estimated about 19 young women between the age of 20 and 30 who are still held in captivity. There is a family of a mother, a father, and two infants, over a year old now and 4 years old, and the parents, and we don't know what their welfare is. In fact, of the 133 people there, the Israelis have documented from their ability to do forensics and video checking and stories from other hostages, about 34 who are dead. This is the official Israeli number, although talks amongst people in Israel and Hamas talks have spoken about more than 70 of the hostages being dead already. It's really tragic, and the hostage families are beyond imagination what they're going through. The vast majority of these hostages are civilians who were taken from their homes or were taken from the Nova Music Festival next to the Gaza Strip. They were not combatants. They were not taken in battle. There were some soldiers, there's a group of soldiers amongst them, who were taken from their military bases while they basically were sleeping, many of them taken in their underwear, and woken up by the sudden attack of Hamas on October 7th.
Yeah, I think the family you're talking about, the Bibas family, and the two children, Ariel and Kfir. And I think Kfir was only 9 months old and Ariel 4 years old at the time. Absolutely shocking. Can you? I'm interested in what pressure Netanyahu is under. But first of all, let's just talk about the parameters of a possible deal. There've been quite a bit of publicity about this in various newspapers, but none of it sort of officially, confirmed. What do we know about a possible deal? What is being said?
Look, I think it's important to know what the positions of the parties have been from the outset. Hamas made very clear at the beginning of this war that its demands were to empty the Israeli prisons from Palestinian prisoners in exchange for all the hostages that it held. During the first 2 or 3 months of the war, that was what we heard from Hamas, mostly all hostages for all prisoners. In the last couple of months, Hamas has indicated that it's willing to compromise on the issue of prisoners, but they're not willing to compromise on the issue of ending the war. This has been their demand, and all the talks that have gone on until now have failed because Israel has refused to agree to end the war, whether it be starting with a short ceasefire or a temporary break from the war or a full and permanent ceasefire. Israel refuses. Israel's demand has been for the hostages to be released unconditionally. And of course, Israel refuses to end the war, but Israel has indicated, as it did in November, it negotiated a deal for the women and children hostages in exchange for women and teenage prisoners in Israel. And we had a week of ceasefire. Israel has also demanded that it continue its military presence in Gaza because there's no way of protecting Israel if Israel is not there. And Israel has also said that it will not allow or only allow in small numbers and only women and children, Gazans from the south of Gaza to return to their homes in the north of Gaza. This has been a way of Israel controlling the flow of population and being able to monitor the smuggling of weapons or the movement of Hamas and Islamic Jihad soldiers.
So that's a pretty big. I mean, you've got over 1 million people in the south, the majority who've come, who fled from the north. So that's quite
1.5 million people are between the cities of Khan Yunis and Rafah, which is 20% of the Gaza Strip in the south of the Gaza Strip, and the overwhelming Rafah was a city of about 300,000 people before the war, and now there are 1.5 million people there. So it's really, really densely populated. They're living in tent cities. They're displaced people. Most of them don't have homes to return to because their homes have been destroyed in the war by Israel.
Yeah. I'm going to read, this is from, just checking which paper this is from. This is from the newspaper, from Al Akhbar in Lebanon, which published details of it, what it says was the agreement, or the proposal being put to Hamas. It says that in the first phase, IDF activities in the Gaza will be suspended for 40 days. During this time, 3 hostages would be released every 3 days. First women, then female soldiers until the 33rd day. And then there's a whole series of phases. The next phase is a release of sick and wounded and people over 50. This takes place, ultimately ending with significant numbers of prisoners being released in Israeli jails. So you're saying we don't have any. It's not clear that what you were indicating to me that in actual fact these details have not been hammered out yet.
Look, we don't know for sure. There's a lot of things in the newspapers that we don't know if this is true or not. I met several days ago with an Egyptian intelligence officer. After the Egyptian Central Intelligence team was in Israel, they stayed for 3 days. They slept over in a hotel in Israel. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before. And they were here to put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government, on the Israeli military to come up with a deal. And what I understood from my discussion with the senior intelligence officer was that they had agreed with the Israelis on a framework. And the framework may include some of those stages. I understood they were talking about 33 hostages, and they were talking about a 6-week ceasefire. It might be 40 days, because I've also heard that thrown out. There was no Israeli obligation to end the war. What the Egyptian told me that there was an Israeli agreement to allow free movement of people within Gaza, which means that the Israeli troops would have to redeploy to locations not where they are currently. There's an agreement, although it's not clear of how many Palestinian prisoners would be released. The reports that I've seen have been either between 30 and 50 Palestinian prisoners for each hostage. Hamas has been saying that those prisoners would include the 559 Palestinian prisoners who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis, including some who are thought to be the top terrorists, the ones who are responsible for the death of hundreds of Israelis. It's going to be very difficult for Israel to swallow and agree to, but Israel gave a green light to Egypt, maybe hoping that Hamas would say no. Or maybe the details still need to be hammered out and there's just a framework agreement. In any event, the official Hamas response is supposed to come tonight, and the Israeli decision whether or not to send its top negotiating team to Cairo will be taken tonight or tomorrow morning. If the top negotiating team goes to Cairo, then there is in fact some real progress being made, and we can expect maybe a ceasefire within the next week or 10 days. But we don't know still.
Yeah, but the political signals coming from Netanyahu are the opposite, aren't they?
Well, Netanyahu, under pressure of his own government, we have to understand that not only do we have 133 Israeli hostages, Netanyahu is in fact a hostage of his own government that he formed, because his right-wing flanks of Ben Gvir and Smotrich are holding him hostage, saying if that Israel doesn't attack in Rafah, they would leave the government. If Israel makes a deal which is unacceptable to them and releases Palestinian murderers, they would leave the government. Mr. Lapid, the head of the opposition, has said that if there is an agreement, that he would provide a political net for Netanyahu to continue and pass the agreement through the government or the cabinet, whatever is required. So it's politically not clear what is happening. Netanyahu has said we will attack in Rafah with or without an agreement, and this is, of course, against the United States and all the regional partners. And the United States Secretary Blinken is here right now, and Secretary Blinken has been holding the big carrot of relations with Saudi Arabia in front of the Israelis. And the Saudis are most definite against an Israeli incursion into Rafah, as are the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans. Everyone in the neighborhood is telling Israel not to do it. And we have the additional issue, which is now in front of us, a possible ICC, International Criminal Court, warrants for arrest for Israeli leaders, perhaps including Netanyahu and the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff of the Army and maybe the head of the Mossad and the Shin Bet.
That's never really bothered Israeli military and intelligence figures or politicians before. Warrants have been issued previously. I remember one guy having to step back on a plane at Heathrow because there was a warrant out for him, but generally it hasn't had much effect.
Yeah, it happened to Tzipi Livni when she was foreign minister, and then the British government intervened and nothing happened. And it's true that the ICC has issued warrants against all kinds of war criminals around the world who travel freely or live freely wherever they are, and they were never arrested. The United States is claiming that the ICC has no jurisdiction. That's questionable, and it's certainly questionable from a country which is not even a member of the court, as is Israel, not a member of the court. But it seems, at least according to Israeli journalists and the Israeli media, this is creating hysterics in the Prime Minister's office. They are very worried about these indictments being issued.
Just going back a second, you hinted that you think that is there a possibility that Netanyahu could change his coalition partners and stay in power somehow or other?
No, I don't think the Lapid would never join the government, and if there is no agreement, I think that maybe we would even see Gantz and Eisenkot leaving the government, the moderates who were brought into the government to provide.
So when you say no agreement, you mean no deal on hostages? No
deal on releasing hostages.
Right.
We're reaching a red line as far as these people are concerned, and they pretty much have allowed Netanyahu and the army to do whatever it's wanted to do in Gaza until now. But if there is a deal on the table that they discern that Israel is responsible for foiling, then they would leave the government. Netanyahu would still have his majority of 64. But if this happens and Gantz and Eisenkot leave the government, I think we would expect to see massive, massive demonstrations all over Israel calling for new elections. They're already happening now. They're not massive enough. 2/3 of the Israeli public have already said in polls that they want elections in 2024. But a majority of those are saying still that it should happen at the end of the war. The problem is that Netanyahu apparently has no intention of ending the war. The prolongation of the war is in his political interest, because the longer the war goes on, there are no elections. And the creation of the state in a commission of inquiry headed by a Supreme Court judge to investigate what went wrong that led us to October 7th and who was responsible for the failings of the military and the intelligence and the government on October 7th. That will be formed when the war is over. Hopefully, probably prior to the war being over. It shouldn't have taken this long to form it already. It should be working and figuring out who's responsible, because we all know that the military and the intelligence people have stood up and taken responsibility and said that they would resign when the war is over. The head of Israeli military intelligence resigned last week. He's the first major officer to resign, and this will be just dominoes, one falling after the other, except that Netanyahu refuses to accept any responsibility. He's the person with the ultimate responsibility, and he refuses to take any responsibility.
Everyone listening in, I'd love to get your questions, so please to start putting your questions in the Q&A box so you can put them directly to Gershon. Gershon, this may sound like a bit naive, but I'm slightly confused. I don't know how the negotiations. How is an offer made? This seems like a fairly well structured offer, and the negotiations have been serious, and that the proposals have been put forwards to Hamas. Yet at the same time, you've got Netanyahu making these statements. So just in terms of the process, what happens, and then does it come back to the cabinet? I know the Egyptians are involved, the Qataris are involved, the US are involved. How does that process work?
Right, so there are no direct Israeli-Hamas negotiations. There's no direct contact between them. The Qataris and the Egyptians are the third-party mediators. There is an American team of expert negotiators who have been in Qatar since pretty much the beginning of the war. I assume that they go between Qatar and Cairo back and forth. The lead on the negotiations has transferred between Qatar and Egypt at different phases. My opinion from the beginning was that the Egyptians would be much more effective than the Qataris. The Americans put their money on the Qataris, mainly because they have a lot of interest there, and the Qatari money that funds Hamas. The largest U.S. military base in the region is in Qatar. So they depended a lot more on the Qataris than I depend on the Qataris. I think Qatar is ultimately a state that supports terrorism and supported Hamas and kept it alive all these years by funding it, albeit with the agreement and even request of the Israeli governments of Netanyahu to fund Hamas. But I think the Egyptians are much more effective. Right now, the Egyptians are in the lead, and they communicate directly. There are about 200 people in Israel involved in these negotiations, but they are headed by a retired general, Nitzan Alon, who is someone who I haven't heard a negative word about, which is very unusual for Israeli society. Everyone compliments this man, his integrity, his honesty. I have communicated with him. I found him to be direct and honest. The negotiations, mainly with the Qataris, have been headed by the head of the Mossad, Dedi Barnea. The head of the Shin Bet in Israel, the Shabak, Ronen Bar, has taken the lead with the Egyptians. And when the negotiations are serious, these three men fly either to Doha or to Cairo. And they are the ones who sit mainly with the Israeli War Cabinet in presenting the deals and discussing, getting their mandate from the War Cabinet on what they're allowed to offer, what they're not allowed to offer. On the Hamas side, it's even more complex because there are the Hamas leadership in Doha. There's a group of Hamas members of their Politburo in Istanbul, and of course there's the Hamas in Gaza. And at least in the last 5 months, what I've understood from Hamas people in Doha is that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, has the final word. He doesn't have the only word. Hamas makes decisions by consensus in general. They usually consult with the various members of their Shura Council, the Politburo, who are stationed in different parts of the world. One group of members in the Shura Council who are not consulted with since October 7th are prisoners, because they have been incommunicado since October 7th. They're not allowed to have any contact with the outside world at all, and they're members of the Hamas Politburo in prison. But it's very complicated because in Gaza, the Hamas leadership, presumably all underground in tunnels and bunkers, are not using any digital communication. They're using messengers. They probably have satellite phones, which they can take out and call Doha and communicate with satellite phones, but they're very careful. And within Gaza itself, there's no digital communication taking place whatsoever. So it's a slow process of getting answers from Hamas because they need to consult with each other. They have at different times over the last 6 months, all 7 months, also consulted with Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and other Palestinian factions. But in general, it is a Hamas decision.
Just what do we know roughly what the split is in terms of who holds the hostages? Because, I mean, on that day, October the 7th, you had Hamas clearly running an operation, but then it seemed, I mean, just as my observation, it seemed to be a free-for-all. Lots of groups going in there and just taking anybody at random. So it's clear that several groups have hostages. Do we know there was debate about
It's clear that after a few weeks since the beginning of the war, Hamas had control. They may not have physically held all the hostages, but they knew where all of them were, and they knew who was being held where. But now, almost 7 months into the war, where 70% of Gaza has been physically demolished, and there are presumably thousands of Palestinians buried underneath rubble of buildings that came tumbling down on top of them, we can assume that there are also hostages that were killed in Israeli bombings as well. We don't know the number. Hamas claims that they don't have knowledge of where all 133 hostages are. When they talked about a humanitarian deal of releasing women, children, elderly, sick, and wounded, they claimed that they had only 20. Later, that number was raised to 33, which is the number we're presently talking about. Just yesterday, someone said that they have that they're physically holding only less than 20 of these in the category. So we simply don't know.
Wow.
And I believe Hamas when they say that they don't know where all the hostages are. They don't know how many of them are alive. They have talked about more than 70 of them being dead. They have continued to issue, particularly last week, 2 videotapes they issued of hostages, 2 men hostages, and they showed the American Israeli Hirsch who had his arm blown off on October 7th at the Nova Festival, and he appeared in a video as well.
Yeah, what was the impact of those? I'm going to take some questions in a second. What was the impact of those videos in Israel?
Well, on the one hand, I mean, the Israeli media and politicians immediately call it disgusting Hamas propaganda. On the other hand, this time, the families all immediately told the people in charge that they want the public to see those videos, and the Israeli media put them online pretty quickly. Often these videos in the past were not published. Anyone can go into the Hamas Telegram accounts and see the videos online, but the Israeli media withheld them, did not put them on, and thought it was just playing into Hamas propaganda. But this time the family specifically said, we want you to put it on television, so the whole public saw them. And then there were, particularly after Hirsch's video, there were large numbers of Israelis who went to the streets in front of Netanyahu's house, in the Prime Minister's office, by the Knesset in Tel Aviv, with very loud demonstrations, much louder, much more angry than in the past.
Yeah, I've got a question. There's an anonymous attendee, which is unusual for us. People usually give their names, so I won't. We'll just read the question. And we've asked it in a way. How much pressure is there from the Israeli public to reach a deal? Can you describe the public mood?
I go to the demonstrations every Saturday night, and in fact, right after this talk, my wife and I are going to a demonstration. There's not enough public pressure. We don't have millions on the streets. The public is divided. Netanyahu and his government have managed to politicize the issue of the hostages. In the traditional Israeli left-right divide. If you want an agreement with Hamas, you're on the left. If you don't want an agreement, you're on the right. And now the issue of the campaign of going into Rafah is on the table. If you don't want the Israeli army to continue the war and go into Rafah, then you're part of the support of the government and Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, etc. And if you want Israel not to go in, well, then you're a bunch of softcore lefties who want Hamas to win. So this politicization, I walk around with my yellow ribbon. I have a diskit that the Family Forum put out at the beginning. You saw almost everyone with some kind of identification with the hostage families. Now I ride on public transportation. I often see I'm one of the only people wearing this. Even on television, even a couple of months ago, you had everyone on television with some kind of identification with the hostage families. Now you see a lot of them with an Israeli flag and no longer a ribbon.
I want to read a comment from the National Missions Minister, Ored Strock, on Wednesday. This morning, actually. He discussed a deal with Hamas as reckless, horrible, and even a terrible one. There's no right of existence for a government that tells soldiers who went to the fight that it's throwing it all to trash to save 22 or 33 people. What you're actually saying is 20, 30, it doesn't really matter anymore. So in reaction to this, obviously, some of the families have been very angered.
Yeah, I have 2 responses to that. One is that tragic reality that we face is that Hamas cannot be defeated militarily, because Hamas is not just the physical organization or the military arm of Hamas. Hamas is an idea. And the only way you defeat an idea or an ideology is with a better idea and a better ideology. And what the Israeli government, together with our neighbors, should have been doing is working on a plan for who's going to take responsibility for Gaza and the Palestinian Authority on the day after. And the longer Israel remains in Gaza, the more we will see armed insurgency and a rise of groups that are even more extreme than Hamas. There is no lifeline for Israel remaining in Gaza as a military occupying force, and God forbid they should try to rebuild settlements in Gaza. That would be total disaster. So that's my first response. The guilt here and the responsibility of not having a plan for defeating Hamas is on the shoulders of Benjamin Netanyahu and the right-wing government, who don't want to see any kind of Palestinian independence and freedom and dignity in the aftermath of this tragic war, which has been the bloodiest war that we've seen in 100 years of Jews and Arabs killing each other of this land. Surprisingly, the two-state solution, which I thought was dead, is back on the table and back on the agenda. And it's not only on the agenda of the international community, it's right here in our region, with Jordan and Egypt and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and others pushing for it as part of the reality that has to emerge. The second thing I would say about that comment is that Israel is a society which is built on the solidarity and the understanding that we don't leave anyone behind. We released 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier, and that was a moment of glory in Israelis' history, of Israel recognizing the value that we place on every single Israeli. And if the Israeli government decides to sacrifice these hostages in favor of the war effort of destroying Hamas, which cannot be done, then this will be a breach on the covenant between the state and our society, which will take generations to heal. We lost our confidence in the country and our government, in our army on October 7th, when they failed to protect us. We thought we were protected here, and we lost that, and we'll take time to rebuild it. If Israel forgoes the hostages in favor of this wild military campaign that will not destroy Hamas, there is no ultimate absolute defeat that Netanyahu has been talking about. This will be the destruction of Israeli society. And I think in the aftermath, we will see waves of young Israelis deciding that they have no future in this country.
It would seem to me, Gershon, that whilst the majority of Israelis want to see the hostages released, there also majority of Israelis do not believe that the Palestinians should be running their own affairs in Gaza. I think there's significant support. There's significant public support for that. Basically Israel should be in charge there. That this can never happen again. So it would seem to me that there's no political backing or public support for any kind of longer-term solution. I want to bring in.
I don't relate to wartime polls and wartime sentiments. They don't reflect the reality of coherent, rational thinking, which will develop after the war. Something happened here which was quite amazing on the night that Iran attacked Israel. We had a regional defense alliance working alongside of Israel that included our Arab neighbors, who not only provided intelligence, they actually shot down Iranian drones and cruise missiles. And we saw the development of the kind of alliance which is necessary for the ongoing long-term defense of the state of Israel. That alliance is dependent upon resolving the Palestinian issue. They are no longer willing to accept the continued occupation of Palestine, and we will not have the current leadership that we have in Israel, nor for that matter will the Palestinians have the current leadership that they have. We are on the cusp of a new age of different leaders in Israel and Palestine who will be emerging over the coming years. And if there's one thing that we know in this conflict, in this region, probably in the world is true, is that public opinion is fluid. And it usually changes swiftly with the events taking place and courageous leaders who stand up and change the course of history. We saw that at the time that Sadat visited Israel. Israeli opinion went from 80% against any kind of peace with Egypt that would give up Sinai, to 2 months following Sadat's visit, 80% of Israelis in favor of the Sadat peace agreement. We saw Palestinian public opinion change overnight when Yasser Arafat declared independence in November of 1988, when the Palestinian National Movement's agenda went from all of Palestine to 22% of Palestine, and young Palestinians took to the streets in support of Arafat. Or in 1993, when the Oslo Agreement was signed, demonstrations went out of.
So things can change.
Things will change. They will change.
Okay, let's take some questions now. So Alan Livingston first, and then we'll go to Howard Gatus after that. Alan Livingston, go ahead.
Good morning, Nicholas. Good morning, Gershon.
Hi,
Gershon,
Alan.
you've kind of answered my question, but let me ask you, is there any sign of any new leadership developing in the Palestinian areas, especially in the Gaza area, that may counter Hamas? And how powerful is Hamas in far as clamping down on any kind of new leadership or new concept relating that might be easier to deal with Israel? Is there any sign of anything along those lines? Secondly, I saw where Hamas and Fatah leadership met in Beijing this weekend. Is there any more information on that meeting, and maybe how important was it, or was it just symbolic?
Yeah, so two good questions, Alan. The talks that took place in Beijing are part of a process that have been going on for years now and will lead to nothing, because the representatives of the Palestinian Authority in those talks in Beijing are those connected to Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the President Abbas, and there is no way that he will ever reconcile with Hamas or Hamas will reconcile with him. But the second part of your question is that there have been talks going on for months now between other groups of Palestinians who are mostly part of the opposition to Abbas within the Fatah movement and other Palestinian individuals who have been talking with the Hamas leadership. There were talks that were taking place involving the Hamas leadership in Gaza as well. One thing seems to be clear is that Hamas is willing to not govern Gaza anymore. They don't want to bear that responsibility anymore. The question is how to integrate them into a legitimate Palestinian government that would be acceptable to the United States and to the Western world and to Israel, a government which would be dedicated to the demilitarization of Gaza and the integration of Hamas forces into a Palestinian governmental.
How did that come out? I didn't know that, Gershon. How did that come out? How did Hamas concede it was no longer to be?
Hamas has been saying it for months now, both statements by people like Khaled Mashal and Ismail Haniya, and most recently by Dr. Khalil al-Khaya, who's the deputy of Sinwar in Gaza, who came out that said that Hamas would be willing to lay its arms down in exchange for a genuine two-state solution, a Palestinian state next to Israel. This is the first such statement, but these talks have been going on. One of the key players is, of course, Mohammed Dahlan. Mohammed Dahlan, who sits in Abu Dhabi, is the exiled Palestinian leader from Khan Yunis. He was a classmate of Yahya Sinwar. They're both from Khan Yunis. And Dahlan, with his close relationship with Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the United Arab Emirates, is responsible for about 30% of the humanitarian aid going into Gaza. And Dahlan has set up an operation with about 10,000 volunteers in Gaza who are today delivering aid directly to people's boxes of food with their names on it, and it's taking place without any opposition from Hamas, and they've set up this operation. They also believe that they could enlist many of the Fatah people who have been getting salaries from the Palestinian Authority for years into a security force that simply they're saying if these security force people that were working under Hamas were receiving salaries of $300 a month, and this was basically a job for them, not necessarily ideological, we'll pay them $1,000 a month and we'll integrate them into our security services. So these kind of talks are going on. What I know is that there are a person who seems to be acceptable to almost everyone except Abbas to lead some kind of governing council, a temporary council in Gaza, is someone named Nasser al-Kidwa, Nasser Kidwa was the PLO representative in the United Nations for about 18 years. He was a foreign minister in one of the previous Abbas governments. He's the nephew of Yasser Arafat. His mother was Arafat's sister. He was president of the Yasser Arafat Foundation. In the elections that were supposed to take place in May of 2021, he was heading a joint list supported by Marwan Barghouti. And Nasser is originally from Gaza, and he seems to be acceptable on the ground. There was a recent survey done by a few hundred Fatah members in which Nasser al-Kidwa received, I believe, 56% of the vote of the person most appropriate to lead a government in Gaza at this time. So here's a name that most people don't know. Nasser lives in Nice, actually, right now. He's married to a French woman. 2 years ago, he went back to Gaza and he opened up Arafat's house and started working out of Arafat's house. He did meet with the Hamas people. He's in contact with Dahlan and supported by Dahlan and others. So there are chances that there could be a replacement for the Hamas leadership in Gaza. In order for this to work, there needs to be Israeli acceptance for it. And there is no Israeli acceptance for any alternative. Israel wants Hamas in Gaza. Despite the war. Yahya Sinwar and Benjamin Netanyahu are Siamese twins.
Okay, here's a question from Howard Gatiss. Just you hear this kind of question and statement being said in Israel quite a bit. But Howard, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. I was put on recently to a YouTuber who is somebody who used to be a tour guide in Israel and is now a sort of blogger. It might or might not be Oren Kahanovich. That's not relevant in particular unless Gershon recognizes the name. But he asked the question sort of rhetorically as to why it is that the world pays so much attention to the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian people. And he gave, I guess, two particular examples. One is why it is that the UN has one organization for the Palestinian refugees, and then one other organization for all other refugees worldwide. And then a completely separate example of why it is that the world seems to pay just an inordinate attention to this important but relatively small conflict worldwide. Which was when the food supplies and other supplies started getting difficult. Everybody is talking about the possibility of a famine in Gaza, and this blogger was saying, there are lots of famines in lots of parts of the world, a lot of the time affecting millions of people. Hardly any pays any attention. Why is it that the Palestine issue gets this disproportionate amount of attention?
Right. Well, just the first question about the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, just to correct facts. UNRWA was one of the first organizations created by the United Nations after it was founded, and it was created before the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. The one thing that anyone who understands anything about the United Nations should understand is that once they create an organization, it's almost impossible to shut it down. I once sat with the legal advisor of the Secretary General, who took out a file of about 300 UN organizations that have been created by General Assembly decisions that are still funded and existing, and yet they have no mandate that affects any actual real things in the world. So UNRWA was simply created before the High Commission for Refugees, and as such, it continued to deal with. It wasn't a special decision that the Palestinian refugees should have its own agency. It simply historically was created before the rest. With regard to why this conflict has the attention that it has, it's because of Israel. Israel is a tiny country with an enormous amount of attention in the world, particularly in the West, perhaps because of the important roles that Jews have played in the media, in Hollywood, in banking, in finance, in high tech, in Nobel Peace Prizes. A good Palestinian friend once said to me, "We are so thankful that you Jews are our enemy, because if you weren't, no one would know anything about us." And maybe that's a reflection of what you said. Of course, there are famine and conflicts all over the world. There were never demonstrations at university campuses across the United States on behalf of the millions of Syrian refugees. And look what's happening in campuses around the United States, around the world today because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's just the nature of perhaps Israel and Palestine being the home of the three monotheistic religions, that there are billions of people in the world who have a religious and a historical connection to this land. It is the Holy Land. It is also the crossroads between continents. It plays a very important role in human history and civilization. So I think there are lots of explanations for it.
Who knew, Howard? Who knew?
Indeed. Thank you.
Can we? I mean, I think the bigger picture is what happens next. And we've been talking about Hamas, Fatah. At the very least, there has to be an enormous rebuilding package. What's the thinking about there has to be some kind of interim agreement on what happens next. I mean, there is a ceasefire. Just the sheer amount of rubble, the actual destruction that's taken place there is going to take an enormous effort.
So the only viable option here is that there is some kind of responsible Palestinian body that receives the keys to Gaza and is a temporary administration lasting for around 2 years until there's stability and the Palestinians can hold new elections. During that time, that temporary administration, presumably supported by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, there are 4 ministers in the new Palestinian Authority government who originate from Gaza. Presumably, they would be involved in this administrative council, maybe headed by Nasser al-Qidwa, maybe not, supported by Dahlan, supported by Marwan Barghouti's people. Maybe Marwan Barghouti will be released from prison in a deal and he will rise to some position of leadership. But this temporary administration would invite an Arab-led multinational force to be a peacekeeping force in Gaza. They would not be a force attacking Israel or defending Palestinians, but they would be a peacekeeping force, mainly there as a buffer to prevent any further Israeli incursions, but also to work with the Palestinian temporary government in Gaza's military force to demilitarize Gaza, to decommission weapons, as was done in Northern Ireland, and to also be a credible body that would call for the international community to come in with massive amount of aid to begin working on the reconstruction of Gaza. My own personal opinion, and this is not very supported in the West, is that the Chinese should be involved in this effort as well, because they know how to build infrastructure faster, more efficiently, and cheaper than almost anyone else. It has to be based on Palestinian labor, not on Chinese labor, but Chinese building technology could certainly make a big difference in Gaza. And of course, it has to involve the Americans and the World Bank and the European Union and the Arab Gulf states who are ready to put in billions of dollars if this is in fact the first step toward the liberation of Palestine and having a Palestinian state next to Israel. And that'll be a big part of the package of whatever it is. The Arab states will also only agree to come in a peacekeeping force if it is part of a larger political process that will lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. And here I'll comment that it's very important, if we want to defeat Hamas, to make the two-state solution real for Israelis and Palestinians. And that will require countries like the United Kingdom and the United States and the other OECD nations to recognize the state of Palestine. We've been talking about a two-state solution for 30 years. There are 139 countries out of the 193 member states of the UN that recognize the state of Palestine. By the way, there are 165 countries of the 193 that recognize the state of Israel. And what we should be doing is calling on all 193 member states of the United Nations to recognize the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. While that will not end the Israeli occupation, what it does is remove the question of Palestinian statehood from Israel's veto and puts the future negotiations on different parameters. We're not talking about whether or not there would be a Palestinian state, but what would be its borders, what would be its borders management, what would be the economic relationship, what's the future of Jerusalem and the refugee issue and so on. But the issue of Palestinian statehood needs to be removed from Israel's veto power. And that's part of what needs to happen as well. So it's time. I testified in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the British Parliament on a hearing they held on a two-state solution. They're about to issue their report to the government, and the government is expected to respond. We saw the fiasco last week in the Security Council where the Americans vetoed the call for recognition of the state of Palestine. This was abominable, embarrassing. The United States should not have that power to be able to dismantle the possibility of the two-state solution for moving forward. And the Americans need to change their policy. And it's time for the Brits, who have historic responsibility here, to stand up and recognize the state of Palestine.
I do want to come back to the hostages in just a second, but staying with this idea of the two-state solution, I mean, you and I know very well that really the consensus among many people who'd supported that process for a long time that it had failed, that the Israeli presence within the West Bank was so well entrenched. There's certainly no question of Israel giving up control over Jerusalem, so that the occupation, or whatever you want to call it, has been a reality for so long. The idea of a two-state, there wasn't really a possibility of a viable Palestinian state. And what are you left with? You're left with an argument about rights. Those people who live in this land should all have the same rights. They should all have the right to vote. They should have the right, of freedom of movement, housing, whatever. And this is the recognized reality for a very long time. But you're saying that this conflict has revived the two-state solution in a way.
Primarily because of October 7th, Nicholas. The thought that these two people could live in one state with equality died on October 7th.
The reality for the Israeli government is they don't have to, that you can have one group of people who rules over another, and they've done it quite successfully for the last 50 years.
The October 7th changed all of that. If Netanyahu succeeded in creating a strategy which deluded the Israeli public that they could occupy another people for 56 years and expect to have peace, or close in 2.2 million people in a territory like Gaza with 70% poverty and expect to have quiet, that blew up in our faces on October 7th. And the fact is that there are 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and there has to be a solution that enables each one of these people to have self-determination. The idea that we could have one utopian United States of Israel-Palestine where we're all living happily, it's not going to happen. The need for Palestinians to have their control over themselves in a responsible member of the community of nations in a state which is basically demilitarized by their own decision, because there is no armed struggle in which the Palestinians can achieve victory. They had a kind of victory on October 7th when they killed 1,200 Israelis and abducted 240 others and raped and pillaged and burned people alive. But that was a very short-lived victory. The Palestinians will come out of this war hopefully understanding that the armed struggle is dead, is no longer a viable option for them. And their new leadership will have to stand up and say, as a good friend of mine, Samer Sinjalawi, one of the leaders of the opposition to Abbas within the Fatah movement, he says, listen, we Palestinians recognize that the Jews have been in this land. The Jews have a connection to this land. They have a right to be in this land. But the Jews need to understand that they were never here alone. There are always others in this land, and we are the others. And now they have to recognize our right to exist. And the truth of the matter is that there's a very simple equation here. Palestinians will never have freedom and dignity if Israelis don't have security, and Israel will never have security if the Palestinians don't have freedom and dignity. And that's what it comes down to. It's going to require making hard decisions on borders and withdrawing settlements. It's going to require the Palestinians to accept that there will be or should be a Jewish minority within their state. We're going to have to arrive at the conclusion that walls and fences are not what's going to build peace here, but cross-boundary cooperation. And both sides from the outset of a new peace process are going to have to tackle the issue of education, because what we teach our children is the best reflection of the values of our societies. And rather than leaving it to the end of the process, as was done in Oslo, peace, education, and incitement in public media is going to have to be tackled as a foundation stone of a renewed peace process, because it will only happen when each side believes that the other side is sincere about their intention to live in peace.
Do you get a sense among the families of the hostages about what they expect from a deal beyond that having obviously fundamentally the most important thing is getting their family members back? But is there any sense, is there the same sense of political division among the families, or do they have a similar voice?
A minority group of the hostage families, and they met yesterday with Netanyahu, are people who are telling Netanyahu to go on with the war to conquer Rafah, to destroy Hamas and dismantle them. That's the only way we're going to free our loved ones. They are a minority. The majority group, first of all, say that don't ask us about the price that has to be paid. It's not our decision. We want our loved ones home, whatever the price is. And they're demanding from Israel to make a deal, regardless of whatever the price is. The most important thing to them is bring the hostages home. So they don't get into the political discussions, and the majority of the hostages, they're just demanding from the Israeli government to bring them home.
And while we're with this, I mean, there are more stories coming out. People have given personal testimony, months after being released. Can you talk about some of those stories? And I'm particularly thinking about the women, and there's been a political debate about this, sexual assault and the conditions in which the women have been held. There's been more publicity given to this over the last couple of months.
There's been a lot of documentation and a lot of record taking and testimonies being given by women and other hostages who came home. There was a lot of sexual violence that took place at the Nova, a festival with women ganged, raped, and murdered, and there are testimonies of that. In the frenzy of it all, very little forensic evidence was actually taken. Israel was too in shock and too busy fighting off Hamas while they were still inside the Israeli territories and the kibbutzim, etc., and too busy identifying bodies and then burying them. But it will become even more apparent. The expectation is that some of the women in Gaza are probably very pregnant at this point. There was one woman who came back and had an abortion. She had been raped by her captor. I'm sure that we will hear more and more of these stories. We know in these days and ages that often it takes years, sometimes tens of years, before women who have been sexually abused to come out with the stories of their sexual abuse. It's something which is so traumatic that it's often buried for years and comes out suddenly. And I think that this is what we will hear over time. While Hamas has denied it entirely, saying it's against our core, it's against our beliefs and our fundamental principles of Islam, it nonetheless happened.
Yeah, it's the accusation, I think, that riles possibly Palestinian supporters, and particularly people who are conservative Muslims, the most, because it obviously goes against the very fundamental aspects of the creed. So it's something very difficult to accept that's happening. Gershon, we're going to wrap it up. As ever, it's been a very widespread and thorough conversation. I wish you strength as you continue to fight and write for what you believe in. Thank you very much indeed for your time.